Why was the German army so effective in World War II? For decades, military historians, strategists, and students of the Second World War have returned again and again to this fundamental question. How did a nation that had been humiliated in the First World War, stripped of its military might by the Treaty of Versailles, reduced to an army of just 100,000 men, and devastated by economic catastrophe during the Great Depression, manage to forge, in less than a decade, a war machine that would conquer most of Europe in a matter of months, hold the world's greatest powers at bay for years, and inflict casualties on a scale that staggers the imagination? In this video, we are going to explore exactly that. We will examine the doctrines, the leadership philosophies, the technological innovations, the institutional reforms, the cultural traditions, and the individual qualities that made the Wehrmacht and the German army in particular so remarkably effective in the opening years of the Second World War and, in many respects, throughout the entire conflict. So, without further ado, let us begin. To understand why the German army was so effective in World War II, we must first understand what Germany was building on. The Prussian and German military tradition, stretching back through the 19th century, had bequeathed to its successors a set of deeply ingrained institutional habits and values that few other armies in the world could match. The concept of Auftragstaktik, which translates roughly as mission-type tactics or directive command, was perhaps the single most important of these inheritances. Under this philosophy, commanders at every level from the lowliest corporal up to the most senior field marshal were expected and empowered to exercise independent judgment in pursuit of their assigned objectives. Rather than waiting for explicit orders from above before making a move, German officers were trained to assess the situation before them, understand the intent of their superior commander, and act accordingly. Even if circumstances had changed dramatically from what had been anticipated, this stood in stark and decisive contrast to the top-down, permission-seeking command culture that prevailed in many of the armies Germany would face. The roots of Auftragstaktik ran deep in the Prussian military experience. During the wars of German unification in the 1860s and 1870s, Helmuth von Moltke the Elder had recognized that the speed of modern warfare made it impossible for any single commander to control everything from a central point. Battles were fluid, communications were unreliable, and the fog of war was ever present. The answer, von Moltke concluded, was not to try to control everything from the top, but to cultivate a corps of officers so thoroughly grounded in military doctrine and so deeply imbued with an understanding of their commander's intent that they could operate effectively even when cut off from higher headquarters. This tradition was carried forward, refined, and strengthened through the First World War and the Reichswehr period that followed. By the time Hitler began rebuilding the German military in the 1930s, Auftragstaktik was not just a tactical doctrine, it was part of the DNA of German military culture. The defeat in the First World War, as catastrophic as it was for Germany politically and economically, did not destroy this tradition. In fact, in a perverse way, it strengthened it. The generals who led the Reichswehr through the 1920s and early 1930s were men who had survived the carnage of the Western Front, who had watched the static attritional warfare of the trenches grind millions of men into the mud, and who were determined never to fight that kind of war again. Chief among the institutional architects of the new German military philosophy was Hans von Seeckt, the commander-in-chief of the Reichswehr from 1920 to 1926. Von Seeckt faced what seemed like an impossible task. The Treaty of Versailles had limited Germany to an army of 100,000 men. There could be no mass conscript force, no heavy artillery, no tanks, no air force. But von Seeckt saw an opportunity within this constraint. If Germany could only have a small professional army, then it would be the finest small professional army in the world, a force of exceptional quality that could serve as the trained cadre for the much larger army that Germany would eventually rebuild. Von Seeckt's Reichswehr was an army, built around quality rather than quantity. Every soldier was trained to perform the duties of the rank above him. Sergeants were trained to command platoons, lieutenants to command companies, captains to command battalions. The theory was that when expansion came, this corps of thoroughly trained professionals would be able to absorb and lead the massive influx of conscripts that would follow. And when expansion came in the 1930s, that is precisely what happened. The Wehrmacht that emerged in the mid-1930s was built on a foundation of professional soldiers who had spent years mastering their craft in an institution that placed enormous emphasis on individual initiative, tactical flexibility, and the cultivation of leadership at every level. This was not an accident. It was the deliberate result of years of careful institutional planning during the Versailles era. What else contributed to the extraordinary effectiveness of the German army in the early years of the war? The answer lies partly in a revolution in military thinking that was taking shape simultaneously in several countries, but was embraced and implemented most thoroughly and most rapidly in Germany. This was the concept that would come to be known as blitzkrieg, a word, interestingly, that was more widely used by foreign journalists and Allied propagandists than by the Germans themselves, who tended to prefer terms like Bewegungskrieg or war of movement. Whatever one calls it, the underlying idea was the same. The use of concentrated, fast-moving, armoured and motorised forces, closely supported by tactical air power, to penetrate enemy defences, bypass strong points, drive deep into the enemy rear, disrupt communications and logistics, and create such chaos and confusion that the enemy's ability to respond effectively was paralysed before he could mount a coherent defence. The intellectual origins of what became blitzkrieg were actually multinational. The British officer J.F.C. Fuller had developed a theory of mechanised warfare after the First World War that anticipated many of its key elements. The French theorist Charles de Gaulle had written presciently about the potential of concentrated armoured forces. The Soviet military had been developing its own doctrine of deep battle operations during the 1920s and 1930s. But it was in Germany that these ideas were synthesized, refined, and most importantly, actually implemented in practice. The key figures in this German synthesis were men like Heinz Guderian, Erich von Manstein, and Oswald Lutz, who understood not just the theory of armoured warfare, but its practical implications for organisation, training, logistics, and command. Heinz Guderian stands out above all others as the prophet and practitioner of German armoured doctrine. Born in 1888, Guderian was a signals officer in the First World War who became convinced during the 1920s that the tank was not merely a support weapon for infantry, as most conventional military opinion held, but the decisive arm of future warfare. Guderian devoured the writings of Fuller and Liddell Hart, studied the development of armoured forces in Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, and developed his own comprehensive vision of how tanks should be used. His central insight, and it was a profound one, was that the value of tanks lay not in their individual fighting power, but in their ability to achieve concentration, penetration, and above all, speed. Tanks should not be parcelled out in small packets to support infantry. They should be concentrated in large armoured formations, equipped with their own motorised infantry, artillery and engineers, and used to strike where the enemy was weakest, drive deep before he could react, and sow the kind of disorganisation that multiplied the effect of every subsequent blow. Guderian's ideas found a receptive audience in the new Germany of the 1930s. Hitler, whatever his many catastrophic faults, had a genuine instinct for the bold and the unconventional in military affairs, at least in the early years of his rule. He saw in Guderian's vision of armoured warfare a way to wage war that promised quick, decisive results, rather than the prolonged attritional struggles that had bled Germany white in the First World War. When Guderian demonstrated the potential of his panzer forces in exercises and manoeuvres, Hitler was famously enthusiastic, reportedly exclaiming, "That's what I want," as he watched the armoured columns move at speed across the training grounds. This political patronage gave Guderian and his fellow advocates of armoured warfare the institutional support they needed to push their ideas through a military establishment where plenty of more conservative voices still doubted whether tanks could really be as decisive as the enthusiasts claimed. The result was the creation of the Panzer divisions, and with them, the organisational framework that would make Blitzkrieg a reality. A German Panzer division in 1939 and 1940 was a genuinely revolutionary military formation, unlike anything that had existed before. It combined tanks, motorised infantry, motorised artillery, engineers, anti-tank guns, and communications equipment into a single self-contained unit capable of independent sustained operations at a pace that made the horse-drawn armies of earlier eras look positively antique by comparison. The key to the Panzer Division's effectiveness was not just that it had tanks. Every major military power had tanks by 1939. The key was the integration of different arms into a coherent combined arms team, and above all, the communications and command arrangements that allowed this team to function effectively at high speed. Radio communications were central to the German way of war in a way that they simply were not for most of their opponents in the early years of the conflict. German tanks were equipped with radios not just to receive orders but to send them, which meant that tank commanders at every level could communicate with each other, with supporting aircraft, with infantry, and with artillery in real time as the battle developed. French tanks in 1940 were often equipped only with receivers, which meant that commanders could receive orders from above but could not communicate with their subordinates except by flag signals, a system laughably inadequate for the pace of armoured warfare. British and Soviet tank communications were generally better than the French, but still significantly inferior to the Germans in the critical early period. This communications advantage compounded the effect of every other German tactical advantage, because it meant that German forces could coordinate their actions faster than their opponents could respond. The role of the Luftwaffe in supporting the ground forces was another crucial dimension of German military effectiveness in the early war years. While Germany had been prohibited from having an air force under the Treaty of Versailles, the Reichswehr had maintained a covert aviation program throughout the 1920s, training pilots in the Soviet Union under the secret arrangements of the Treaty of Rapallo and developing doctrine and organizational concepts in parallel. When Hitler openly repudiated the Versailles restrictions in 1935 and the Luftwaffe emerged from the shadows into official existence, it did so already possessed of a cadre of experienced professionals and a body of developed doctrine. Under the command of Hermann Göring, with men like Hans Jaschonek shaping its operational thinking, the Luftwaffe was built primarily as a tactical air force, designed to support ground operations rather than to wage independent strategic bombing campaigns. The Stuka dive bomber, properly known as the Junkers Ju-87, became the most iconic image of Luftwaffe support for the ground battle, and it was genuinely devastating in the right circumstances. Equipped with sirens that emitted a terrifying shriek during the dive, it delivered its bombs with precision that level-bombing aircraft of the era simply could not match, and it could be directed against specific targets, a fortification, a tank formation, a headquarters, in a way that multiplied the ground commander's firepower enormously. In Poland in 1939, in France and the Low Countries in 1940, in the Balkans and North Africa in 1941, the Stuka and other Luftwaffe aircraft played a crucial role in breaking up defensive positions, panicking enemy formations, and clearing the way for the advancing panzers. The psychological effect of air attack on troops who had no effective air cover was immense. Entire formations dissolved under air attack not because casualties were catastrophically high, but because the terror and confusion it generated destroyed unit cohesion and the will to resist. But what truly set the German approach apart was not any single weapon or doctrine in isolation. It was the ability to integrate all these elements: tanks, aircraft, motorized infantry, artillery, communications, into a coherent operational system that could be directed with flexibility and speed at the weakest point in the enemy's position. This integration required not just good equipment and good doctrine, but officers who understood the system as a whole and could make it work under the chaos and stress of actual battle. And here again, the German military's deep institutional investment in officer training and development paid enormous dividends. The German officer corps in 1939 was arguably the finest in the world, not in terms of social prestige or aristocratic pedigree, but in terms of professional competence and practical military judgment. The officers who led Germany's armies in the early years of the war had been forged in a system that placed immense demands on them. The path to an officer's commission in the Wehrmacht ran through years of demanding study, practical exercises, and ruthless selection. The German staff system, built on the traditions established by von Moltke the Elder and refined through successive generations, trained its officers to think operationally as well as tactically, to understand not just how to fight a battle, but how to plan and sustain a campaign. The Kriegsakademie, Germany's staff college, produced graduates who were among the most thoroughly educated military professionals in the world, men who had absorbed not just German military history and doctrine, but the lessons of wars fought by other nations in other eras. Among the brilliant operational minds produced by this system, Erich von Manstein, stands in a class of his own. Born in 1887 into a military family with deep roots in the Prussian tradition, Manstein displayed from the earliest stages of his career a capacity for bold, unconventional operational thinking that set him apart from his contemporaries. It was Manstein who conceived the operational plan for the Fall Gelb, the attack on France and the Low Countries in May 1940, that produced one of the most stunning military victories in modern history. The original German plan for the Western Campaign was a relatively conventional attack through Belgium, a modified replay of the Schlieffen Plan of 1914. Manstein saw its flaws immediately. It would run into the strongest part of the Allied defences, the British Expeditionary Force, and the best French armies would be waiting in Belgium, and the element of surprise would be largely absent since the Allies would be expecting exactly this kind of attack. Manstein's alternative was breathtakingly audacious. He proposed concentrating the main German armoured strength in Army Group A and driving it through the Ardennes forest, which conventional military wisdom held to be impassable for armoured forces, and then breaking out onto the plains of northern France, crossing the Meuse River and driving straight for the English Channel at Abbeville. If the plan worked, it would cut off the Allied forces that had advanced into Belgium from their lines of communication and supply, trapping them in a great pocket with the sea at their backs. The very boldness of the concept was part of its genius. The Allies would not be expecting an armoured thrust through the Ardennes precisely because it seemed too difficult, too risky, too contrary to accepted military logic. Their attention would be fixed on Belgium, and by the time they understood what was happening in the Ardennes, it would be too late. The plan faced enormous resistance within the German military establishment. Many senior officers considered it reckless to the point of lunacy. The Ardennes was not tank country, they argued. The logistical problems of moving that many armoured and motorised vehicles through narrow forest roads would create massive traffic jams that would doom the operation before it began. And what if the French reacted quickly and counterattacked the extended German flank before the advance reached the Channel? The risks were enormous, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. Hitler, to his credit in this instance, sided with Manstein. The plan was adopted, and on May 10, 1940, with simultaneous strikes through Belgium and the Ardennes, the campaign began. Within 6 weeks, France had fallen, the British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk, and Germany had achieved a victory of such speed and totality that it shook the entire world. What made the fall of France so revealing about German military effectiveness was not just the operational brilliance of the plan, but the way it was executed at every level. The officers and men who drove through the Ardennes and across the plains of France did not simply follow orders. They improvised, adapted, seized opportunities, and kept driving forward with an aggression and momentum that left their opponents perpetually off balance. General Hermann Hoth's Panzer Corps raced across France at a pace that outstripped the expectations of the German High Command itself. Erwin Rommel, then commanding the 7th Panzer Division, moved so fast and so unpredictably that his division became known as the Ghost Division, because even the German headquarters sometimes did not know where it was. These commanders did not wait for permission to exploit an opportunity. They acted on their own initiative in the spirit of Auftragstaktik, and their actions collectively produced a campaign of almost incomprehensible speed. The human dimension of the Wehrmacht's effectiveness in this period deserves careful attention, because it is easy to focus on doctrine, technology, and organizational structure while overlooking the qualities of the individual soldiers who had to implement these things under conditions of extreme stress, danger, and physical hardship. The German soldier of the early war years was, by almost any measure, an exceptionally effective fighting man. He was well trained, physically fit, disciplined, and imbued with a strong sense of unit cohesion and esprit de corps. He had been raised in a society that placed enormous emphasis on collective purpose, self-sacrifice, and martial virtue, qualities that translated directly into combat effectiveness. He had also, in many cases, been specifically prepared for the kind of fast-moving, decentralized warfare that German doctrine called for. Even at the level of the individual infantryman, the emphasis on initiative and independent judgment was present. German infantry tactics stressed the importance of small unit actions, of squads and sections acting decisively without waiting for orders from above. The role of non-commissioned officers, the NCOs, the sergeants and corporals who are the backbone of any effective fighting force, was particularly significant in the German army. German NCOs were trained to a standard that in many other armies would have qualified them for officer rank. They were expected to lead their sections and squads aggressively in battle, to make tactical decisions on the spot, and to maintain the momentum of an advance even when their officers were killed or wounded. This meant that even when a German unit lost a significant portion of its officers in battle, it retained a substantial residual capacity for effective tactical action because the NCOs could step up and keep the unit functioning. Contrast this with armies where the NCO cadre was less thoroughly trained and less empowered, and where the loss of officers could cause a unit to become temporarily paralysed and unable to act effectively, and you begin to understand another dimension of German military advantage. The training that German soldiers received before they saw combat was also, in the early years of the war, significantly more rigorous and more realistic than what most of their opponents experienced. German training exercises were conducted under conditions designed to simulate as closely as possible the chaos and stress of actual battle. Live ammunition was used in training with the risks that entailed. Sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and deliberate psychological pressure were incorporated into training programs to harden soldiers for the realities they would face in combat. The philosophy behind this approach was that it was better for soldiers to experience hardship and stress in training, where the consequences of failure were recoverable, than to encounter these conditions for the first time in actual combat, where the consequences could be fatal. This training philosophy produced soldiers who, when they finally did enter battle, found it difficult but not impossible, stressful but manageable, because they had already experienced something approximating its demands. One aspect of German training that deserves particular emphasis is the emphasis placed on combined arms cooperation at every level. German soldiers were trained not just in the skills of their own branch or arm of service, but in understanding how their actions interacted with those of other branches. Infantry soldiers understood how to work with tanks. Tankers understood how to cooperate with artillery. Artillery officers understood how their support related to the needs of the attacking infantry. This cross-arm understanding facilitated the kind of smooth, instinctive combined arms coordination that was at the heart of German tactical effectiveness. It was not something that happened automatically or naturally. It was the product of deliberate training and institutional emphasis on combined arms warfare as the fundamental mode of German military operations. The logistical underpinning of German military effectiveness is less glamorous than the dramatic panzer thrusts and the audacious operational maneuvers, but it was no less important. The Wehrmacht in 1939 and 1940 was genuinely excellent at the unglamorous but vital business of keeping its fighting formations supplied with ammunition, fuel, spare parts, food, and all the other necessities of sustained military operations. The German supply system was not without its flaws, and in the later years of the war, as the theatre of operations expanded beyond anything that the logistical system had been designed to support, those flaws would become catastrophic. But in the campaigns of 1939 and 1940, German logistics worked well enough to sustain the rapid operational tempo that the Wehrmacht's doctrine demanded. The motorized supply columns that fed the panzer divisions could keep pace with advancing armor in a way that horse-drawn supply transport simply could not, and this operational mobility of the supply system was a crucial enabler of the kind of fast-moving warfare that Germany excelled at. So, what does this tell us so far? The Wehrmacht's effectiveness in the early war years was not the product of any single factor, but of a complex and mutually reinforcing system of advantages that worked together to produce results that exceeded the sum of their parts. The deep institutional traditions of the Prussian and German military, the doctrine of Auftragstaktik, the revolution in armoured and mechanized warfare pioneered by Guderian and his colleagues, the development of close air support as an integral component of ground operations, the exceptional quality of the officer and NCO corps, the rigorous and realistic training system, and the effective logistical support for rapid operations all combined to create a military force of formidable, indeed in the circumstances of 1939 to 1941, almost overwhelming effectiveness. But the story does not end there. To truly understand why the German army was so effective, we need to look more closely at specific dimensions of this effectiveness, at the campaigns in which it was most vividly demonstrated, and the individual commanders who embodied its qualities most completely. So let us continue our examination. The campaign in Poland in September 1939, the opening act of the Second World War, provided the first dramatic demonstration of German military effectiveness in the new conflict. Germany's attack on Poland was not just the first application of modern armoured warfare on a large scale. It was a devastating display of coordinated multi-arm operations against an opponent who, for all the individual courage and determination of its soldiers, was simply not equipped to deal with the speed and violence of the German assault. The Polish army had approximately 1 million men under arms when the war began. It had cavalry, artillery, and some armour. Its soldiers fought with extraordinary bravery throughout the campaign, and the popular image of Polish cavalry charging German tanks with lances, while largely mythological in its specific details, captures something true about the desperate courage with which Poland's defenders faced an overwhelming enemy. But courage alone could not compensate for the fundamental mismatch in doctrine, technology, and operational method between the Polish and German forces. The German attack on Poland involved roughly 1.5 million men, organised into two army groups striking simultaneously from the north and the south, with the goal of encircling and destroying the main Polish forces before they could withdraw to the east. Army Group North under General Fedor von Bock attacked from Pomerania and East Prussia, while Army Group South under General Gerd von Rundstedt attacked from Silesia and Slovakia. The panzers of both army groups drove deep into Polish territory at a speed that made any coherent Polish defensive response impossible. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, struck Polish airfields in the opening hours of the campaign, effectively destroying a large portion of the Polish air force on the ground before it could mount significant opposition. With air superiority secured almost immediately, German aircraft were free to roam over the battlefield, striking Polish troop concentrations, supply columns, and communications centres at will. What impressed even experienced military observers about the Polish campaign was the rapidity with which German armoured and motorised formations bypassed and surrounded Polish defensive positions rather than attacking them frontally. Where a conventional army might have paused to reduce a fortified position before advancing, German commanders typically massed it with sufficient force to prevent a breakout and drove on, leaving the surrounded position to wither on the vine. This willingness to leave enemy forces in place rather than being drawn into time-consuming attritional battles to reduce them was itself a product of the Auftragstaktik philosophy. Individual commanders understood that their mission was to advance and encircle, not to fight for every piece of ground, and they acted accordingly without needing to be told explicitly in every case. Poland was overrun in just over 4 weeks, a campaign of stunning brevity that sent shockwaves through the military establishments of every European power. The lessons of Poland were interpreted differently by different audiences. In France and Britain, there was a tendency to discount the campaign as not representative of what would happen when Germany faced an opponent more comparable in strength and modernity. Poland was considered a backward country, poorly equipped and poorly organised, and its rapid defeat was attributed as much to its weakness as to Germany's strength. This was a catastrophic misreading of what the German army had demonstrated. The few voices, Charles de Gaulle in France, and certain analysts in Britain, who recognised that the German combination of armoured and air power represented something genuinely new and genuinely dangerous, were largely ignored. The French and British high commands continued to plan for the war they understood, a defensive war of fortified lines and attritional attrition, rather than the war the Germans intended to fight. The German victory in the West in May and June 1940 remains one of the most studied and most debated military campaigns in modern history. In just 6 weeks, Germany accomplished what had eluded the Kaiser's armies for 4 years of grinding attritional warfare in the First World War. France, a nation of 40 million people with one of the largest and theoretically best equipped armies in the world, was knocked out of the war with a speed that astonished almost everyone, including many German commanders themselves. How was this possible? The answer lies not simply in German superiority, but in the specific interaction between German strengths and French weaknesses, and in the way Manstein's brilliant operational plan exploited those weaknesses with a ruthlessness and precision that left the French with no margin for error and no time to recover from their initial mistakes. The French army in 1940 was not the broken, demoralised force that subsequent mythology sometimes portrays. It had approximately 2 million men in the field, substantial armoured forces including tanks that in individual combat performance were often superior to their German counterparts, and a long tradition of military excellence. The Maginot Line, the elaborate system of fortifications running along the Franco-German border from Switzerland to Luxembourg, was a genuine military achievement, a fortress system of extraordinary sophistication that would have been enormously costly to attack frontally. French artillery was excellent, French infantry was competent, and French commanders at the operational and strategic level were not without ability. So why did France fall so quickly and so completely? The fundamental problem was not one of equipment or individual courage, but of doctrine, command culture, and the speed of decision-making. The French army operated on a command rhythm that was simply incompatible with the pace of modern mechanized warfare. Orders moved through a hierarchy that required approval at multiple levels before action could be taken. Information moved upward, to the top before decisions moved back down, a process that might take 12, 24, or even 36 hours to complete. In a static defensive war of the kind that had been fought in the First World War and for which the French system had been designed, this tempo of decision-making was adequate. In a war where armoured forces could advance 60 or 80 kilometres in a day, it was fatal. By the time a French commander had received and processed information about where the Germans were, transmitted it up the chain, received a decision back, and issued orders to his subordinates, the situation had changed so dramatically that the orders were obsolete before they could be executed. This is perhaps the clearest possible illustration of the decisive advantage that Auftragstaktik conferred on the German army. German commanders at every level did not need to wait for permission to act. They assessed the situation before them, identified the action that best served their superiors' intent, and acted. This meant that the German decision cycle, what later military theorists would call the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, was dramatically faster than the French equivalent. And in modern mechanized warfare, the side with the faster decision cycle has an enormous advantage because it can act inside the opponent's decision cycle, creating new realities faster than the opponent can respond to them. Every time the French believed they understood what the Germans were doing and began to formulate a response, the situation had already changed again. The crossing of the Meuse River at Sedan on May 13, 1940, was the pivotal moment of the entire campaign, and it illustrates perfectly the German way of war at its most effective. General Erich von Manstein had conceived the plan, but it was General Ewald von Kleist's Panzer Group, and within it, General Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps that had to execute the most dangerous and decisive phase, the actual crossing of the Meuse under fire. Guderian pushed his units forward with a relentlessness that alarmed even his own superiors. Moving faster than his own logistics and flank protection could comfortably support, he drove his panzers westward toward the Channel with an aggressive momentum that seemed to leave no room for the caution that military convention demanded. When his superiors at army group level, nervous about the exposed southern flank of the penetration, ordered him to halt and consolidate, Guderian pushed back, arguing that the enemy situation required continued advance, and eventually obtained permission to continue what he described as a reconnaissance in force, a label that everyone understood was a polite fiction for pressing the advance at full speed. This willingness of German commanders to push beyond the limits of what seemed prudently possible was a recurring feature of German operational success in the early war years. It reflected not recklessness, but a genuine operational understanding that in mobile warfare, tempo is itself a weapon. Every hour of advance denied the enemy time to react, reorganize, and establish a new defensive line. Every kilometer of penetration increased the chaos and disorganization in the enemy's rear. The costs of pausing to consolidate were often higher in operational terms than the risks of continuing to advance, even with exposed flanks and stretched supply lines. German commanders understood this instinctively because their training and doctrine had prepared them for exactly this kind of thinking. The French response to the Meuse crossing was precisely what Manstein and Guderian had hoped for and expected. It was slow, uncoordinated and insufficient. General Gamelin, the French supreme commander, was 67 years old and accustomed to the measured pace of Great War staff work. He had no telephone in his headquarters at the Château de Vincennes and communicated exclusively by dispatch rider, a method of communications that added hours to every decision cycle. When the news of the Meuse crossing reached him, it took him days to grasp the true significance of what had happened and to order a response. By the time French armoured reserves were being organised for a counterattack, the German panzers were already racing for the Channel, and the opportunity to cut the penetration at its root had passed. On May 21st, British and French forces mounted an armoured counterattack at Arras that briefly alarmed Rommel, then commanding the 7th Panzer Division, and caused the German High Command genuine concern. But the counterattack was too small, too late, and too isolated to alter the fundamental situation. The encirclement of the Allied forces in Belgium and northern France was complete. The evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk between May 26th and June 4th, 1940, in which over 300,000 British and French troops were rescued by the extraordinary effort of the Royal Navy and the flotilla of civilian vessels that joined them, has rightly been celebrated as an act of extraordinary courage and improvisation. But it should not obscure the fundamental reality that the campaign had been a crushing German victory. France was left with its best armies gone or destroyed, its capital occupied, and its government forced to sign an armistice in the same railway carriage at Compiègne, where Germany had been forced to sign its armistice in November 1918, a deliberate piece of symbolism orchestrated by Hitler to reverse what he saw as the humiliation of the First World War's end. The speed and totality of the German victory left the world stunned. Would the German army's effectiveness be sustained as the war expanded and the opponents became more formidable? This is a question that the subsequent course of the war would answer in complicated and sometimes contradictory ways. The invasion of the Soviet Union, which began on June 22, 1941, with Operation Barbarossa, was the greatest military operation in history, and in its opening phase it produced German successes on a scale even more spectacular than anything that had come before. But it also planted the seeds of eventual German defeat, because it confronted the Wehrmacht with an opponent whose size, resources, and eventual military learning curve would prove impossible to overcome. Operation Barbarossa was launched with 3 million German soldiers and their Axis allies advancing along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb drove toward Leningrad. Army Group Center under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, with the two most powerful panzer groups assigned to it, drove toward Moscow via Minsk and Smolensk. Army Group South under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt drove into Ukraine toward Kiev and the Donbass industrial region. The initial results were staggering. In the first weeks of the campaign, German forces destroyed or encircled entire Soviet armies, capturing or killing hundreds of thousands of men in a series of massive encirclement battles that dwarfed anything seen in the Western campaign. The Battle of Białystok-Minsk in late June produced the capture of approximately 300,000 Soviet prisoners. The Battle of Kiev in September 1941 produced the greatest encirclement in military history, with over 600,000 Soviet soldiers killed or captured. These victories demonstrated that the German army's effectiveness was not merely a function of fighting inferior opponents. The Red Army in 1941, while it had been seriously weakened by Stalin's purges of its officer corps in the late 1930s, was not negligible. It had large numbers of tanks, many of them technically superior to German armour. It had substantial artillery. It had enormous reserves of manpower. And yet, in the opening months of Barbarossa, it was defeated again and again with a consistency that suggested the German military system had genuine, deep advantages over its Soviet counterpart. The same qualities that had made Germany so effective in Poland and France, the speed of decision-making, the aggression of armoured exploitation, the close coordination of air and ground forces, the quality of the officer and NCO corps, were producing similar results on a vastly larger stage. Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group was perhaps the most striking embodiment of German offensive power during Barbarossa's opening phase. Driving deep into Soviet territory at a pace that sometimes covered 200 kilometers in a week, Guderian's panzers repeatedly outran the infantry armies that were supposed to be following in their wake, creating pockets of encircled Soviet forces that stretched the German lines of communication to their limits. Guderian himself, like many German armoured commanders of this era, commanded from well forward, close to the leading elements of his forces, which gave him an immediate feel for the tactical situation but also put him at constant personal risk. On multiple occasions during Barbarossa, Guderian's command vehicle was under direct fire from Soviet troops, and several officers on his staff were killed or wounded while accompanying him. This willingness to lead from the front was characteristic of the best German commanders, and it had significant practical benefits in terms of the quality and speed of decision-making. Yet even in the midst of these spectacular successes, the strains that would eventually overwhelm the German war machine were beginning to show. The Soviet Union was simply too large, its population too great, and its industrial capacity, once relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, out of range of German air attack, too substantial for Germany to defeat by the same kind of rapid operational stroke that had worked against Poland, France, and the smaller European nations. German planners had estimated that the campaign would last 8 to 10 weeks, roughly the same as the fall of France. They had not adequately planned for a campaign of longer duration. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometres from railheads that had to be converted from the European gauge to the wider Russian gauge before German trains could operate on them, a process that fell further and further behind the advance. The Wehrmacht's transport fleet, never fully motorised, relied heavily on horses for its supply columns, and the Russian road network, such as it was, rapidly disintegrated under the weight of military traffic and autumn rain into a quagmire that brought movement to a near halt. The German army's logistical system, which had been adequate for the short campaigns of 1939 and 1940, was being pushed well beyond its design limits by the scale and duration of the Eastern Front fighting. This was not a failure of German military effectiveness in the narrow tactical and operational sense. German soldiers continued to fight with extraordinary professionalism and effectiveness throughout the summer and autumn of 1941. It was a failure at the strategic and grand strategic level, a failure to match military ambition with the material means necessary to sustain it. And this failure had roots in decisions made at the political level, in Hitler's conviction that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly, in the willingness to plan for a short campaign rather than a long one, and in the fundamental mismatch between Germany's resource base and the demands of a war against the coalition of industrial giants that Germany's strategic choices had assembled against it. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center in the autumn of 1941, watched as his forces struggled toward Moscow against increasingly stiffening resistance. Operation Typhoon, the final German drive on Moscow, began on September 30th, 1941, and in its opening phase achieved spectacular results. The double encirclement battles at Vyazma and Bryansk in October 1941 produced the capture of approximately 600,000 more Soviet soldiers, numbers that seemed to confirm that victory was at hand. But the mud of the autumn Rasputitsa, the season when Russian roads turned to impassable mire, followed by the onset of winter, brought the German advance to a halt just kilometers short of Moscow. German soldiers in forward positions could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars, but they could not reach them. The failure to capture Moscow before winter was not simply a product of the weather, though the weather was certainly a contributing factor. It was also a product of the extraordinary resilience of the Soviet state and the Red Army, and of strategic decisions made by the German High Command during the summer of 1941 that diverted Army Group Center's panzer forces away from the main drive on Moscow for several critical weeks. Hitler's insistence on diverting Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group south in August to participate in the Kiev encirclement, against the advice of most of his senior commanders who believed the drive on Moscow should be the priority, consumed crucial weeks and resources that could not be recovered before winter. Whether a direct drive on Moscow in August, rather than October, would have succeeded is one of history's great counterfactual questions, but there is little doubt that the delay contributed significantly to the failure of the Moscow operation. The winter crisis of 1941 to 1942, when Soviet counteroffensives launched in December 1941, drove the exhausted and under-equipped German forces back from Moscow across a broad front, tested the German army's effectiveness in a new and brutal way. German troops were not equipped for winter warfare of the kind they now faced. They had no proper winter uniforms, inadequate cold-weather lubricants for their weapons and vehicles, and in many cases, no shelter beyond what they could improvise from destroyed Soviet villages. Men froze to death at their posts. Tanks would not start in temperatures of -30 or 40 degrees Celsius. Machine guns jammed. Artillery shells failed to detonate. The German soldier's extraordinary adaptability and his willingness to endure privation that would have broken less well-trained and less motivated troops were the only things that prevented the German front from collapsing entirely during those terrible winter months. Hitler's order to hold fast, to stand and fight rather than conduct the elastic defensive withdrawals that many German commanders believed were necessary to preserve their forces, was controversial at the time and has remained so among historians ever since. Many senior German officers, including Guderian, Höppner and others, were relieved of their commands during this crisis for retreating without permission or for advocating withdrawals that Hitler refused to sanction. These reliefs caused significant disruption at a critical moment and robbed the army of experienced combat leaders. Yet there is a genuine argument that Hitler's stand-fast order, as brutal and costly as it was, did prevent a disorderly rout of the kind that had destroyed Napoleon's Grande Armée in 1812. The German line held more or less through the winter of 1941 to 1942, and by the spring of 1942 the Wehrmacht was ready to resume offensive operations. The spring and summer of 1942 saw Germany launch its Great Southern Offensive, Case Blue, aimed at capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus and the Volga city of Stalingrad, which both controlled vital supply routes and bore the name of the Soviet dictator. This campaign demonstrated again the formidable operational capabilities of the German army when conditions favoured the kind of mobile warfare it excelled at. The initial phases of Case Blue produced dramatic advances across the southern Russian steppe, with German and Allied forces driving hundreds of kilometres in a matter of weeks. Army Group South was split into Army Groups A and B to pursue the twin objectives of Caucasus and Stalingrad simultaneously, a division of effort that some commanders felt dangerously overstretched German capabilities. The Battle of Stalingrad, which began in the autumn of 1942 and ended with the catastrophic surrender of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army in February 1943, marked a decisive turning point, not just in the war but in the story of German military effectiveness. Stalingrad demonstrated with brutal clarity both the continued extraordinary tactical effectiveness of the individual German soldier and the fundamental strategic and operational overextension that was beginning to doom the German war effort. German troops fighting in the ruins of Stalingrad displayed a ferocity, tenacity and tactical skill that was genuinely remarkable. House by house, room by room combat in a devastated city was the antithesis of the mobile warfare in which Germany's army excelled. Yet even in this alien environment, German soldiers fought with a professionalism that inflicted enormous casualties on their Soviet opponents. But the city of Stalingrad was not, in the end, an appropriate measure of German military effectiveness. It was a trap, and the Soviet general Georgy Zhukov and his colleague Alexander Vasilevsky had set it brilliantly. While the German 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army ground themselves down in the street fighting, Zhukov and Vasilevsky were secretly assembling the forces for Operation Uranus, the encirclement of the Stalingrad salient. The flanks of the German position were held by Romanian, Italian and Hungarian forces, the armies of Germany's Axis partners, who lacked the equipment, training and morale of the German army. On November 19, 1942, Soviet armoured forces smashed through these weaker flanks in coordinated attacks from north and south, met at Kalach on the Don River 4 days later, and encircled the entire 6th Army, roughly 300,000 men, in a pocket from which there would be no escape. The failure to break the encirclement and either rescue the 6th Army or allow it to break out before the pocket solidified is one of the most debated episodes of the war. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, appointed to command Army Group Don in November 1942 with the mission of relieving Paulus, came agonizingly close to achieving what seemed impossible. Operation Winter Storm, the relief attempt launched in December 1942, drove to within 40 kilometers of the Stalingrad pocket before being halted by Soviet resistance and forced into retreat by Soviet counterattacks on other parts of the front. Manstein urged Paulus to break out toward the relief force, arguing that military necessity required it even if Hitler had forbidden a breakout. Paulus refused, citing Hitler's explicit order to hold the city. The Sixth Army's fate was sealed. By February 2nd, 1943, the last organized resistance had ended, and roughly 90,000 exhausted, frostbitten survivors, the remnant of an army that had once numbered 300,000, marched into Soviet captivity. Stalingrad was a catastrophe without precedent in German military history. It was not just the loss of the Sixth Army, devastating as that was. It was the psychological blow, the shattering of the myth of German invincibility, the demonstration that the Wehrmacht could be encircled and destroyed as well as encircle and destroy. It gave the Soviet side, and to a significant degree the entire Allied side, a confidence that the war could be won, that the German military machine, however formidable, was not invulnerable. And it came at the same time as other significant reversals. The defeat of Rommel's Afrika Korps at El Alamein in November 1942, and the Allied landings in North Africa that followed, which opened a second front that would lead eventually to the invasion of Sicily and Italy. What was happening in the East in 1942 and 1943, that was reducing Germany's military advantage. Several things simultaneously. The Red Army was learning. Stalin's purges had decapitated the Soviet officer corps in 1937 and 1938, eliminating many of the most experienced and talented commanders and replacing them with political loyalists who often lacked the professional competence of the men they had replaced. But by 1942, a new generation of Soviet commanders was emerging, men like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Vatutin, and Konev, who had learned the hard lessons of the early defeats and were adapting their operational methods accordingly. Soviet armoured formations were being reorganised and retrained along lines that showed a clear understanding of what had made the German armoured forces so effective. Soviet communications were improving. Soviet logistics were being strengthened by the extraordinary industrial effort that had relocated and rebuilt Soviet industry in the Urals and beyond. And the massive influx of American Lend-Lease aid was providing the trucks, jeeps, and other motorized vehicles that the Red Army needed to give its own armored advances the mobility they had previously lacked. At the same time, the German army was being progressively weakened by the attrition of fighting the largest land war in history against an opponent with vastly greater reserves of manpower. German casualties on the Eastern Front were staggering. By the end of 1941, Germany had suffered over 800,000 casualties in the East, a number that exceeded total German military casualties in all of the First World War's first 2 years. By the end of 1942, total German military casualties since the start of Barbarossa exceeded 3 million. These losses could not be fully replaced. The experienced, highly trained soldiers who had made the Wehrmacht so effective in 1939 to 1941 were dying faster than they could be replaced, and their replacements, however brave and willing, were inevitably less thoroughly trained and less experienced than the men they succeeded. The quality of the German officer corps was also being eroded, though more slowly. The brilliant operational commanders of the early war years, Guderian, Manstein, Rommel, Hoth, were still there and still capable of brilliant performance. But below the senior level, the pool of experienced, tactically proficient officers was shrinking. Casualties among junior officers were particularly high because the German tradition of leading from the front, which had such positive effects in terms of command responsiveness and morale, also meant that officers were disproportionately exposed to the dangers of combat. By 1943 and 1944, the average German frontline officer was significantly less experienced than his equivalent in 1940 or 1941, and this erosion of quality at the junior and middle levels of the officer corps was beginning to reduce the effectiveness of German tactical operations in ways that were not always visible in the aggregate, but were steadily cumulative in their effect. Yet even against these mounting pressures, the German army continued to demonstrate a level of tactical and operational effectiveness that consistently exceeded what its material circumstances might have suggested. The Battle of Kharkov in February and March 1943 is perhaps the most striking example of this continued excellence. Following the Stalingrad disaster, the German front in the south was in a state of near collapse. Soviet forces had driven deep into the German rear, capturing Kharkov, the fourth largest city in the Soviet Union, and threatening to tear the entire German southern front apart. It was in these circumstances that Erich von Manstein, the most brilliant operational mind in the German army, conceived and executed a counter-offensive that ranks among the greatest defensive-offensive maneuvers in military history. Rather than attempting to hold a continuous defensive line, which German forces lacked the strength to do, Manstein allowed the Soviet advance to continue, pulling back German forces in a controlled manner and drawing the overstretched Soviet spearheads deeper into German-held territory, extending their supply lines and exhausting their forward momentum. Then, when the Soviet advance had spent itself and the attacking formations were dangerously exposed, Manstein struck with concentrated armoured forces in the flanks, cutting off the advanced Soviet units from their supply and support, destroying them in detail, and recapturing Kharkov in a counter-offensive that produced German operational success on a scale that seemed incredible, given the weakness of Germany's position just weeks before. The Kharkov counter-offensive was a masterwork of the kind of elastic, flexible operational thinking that characterized German military excellence at its best, and it demonstrated that even in 1943, even on the defensive, the German army could still produce operational results that astonished the world. But Kharkov was a last great flourish rather than a turning of the tide. The fundamental strategic reality was unchanged, and indeed was growing steadily worse for Germany. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943, Operation Citadel, was Germany's last major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front, and its failure marked the definitive end of German strategic initiative in the East. The Germans had intended Citadel as a means of eliminating the large Soviet salient around Kursk and destroying enough Soviet armor to regain strategic freedom of action. But the Soviets, forewarned by intelligence, including information from the famous Lucy spy ring and from the British ultra-decrypts of German signals, had prepared the Kursk position with extraordinary thoroughness. Hundreds of kilometers of defensive lines, minefields, anti-tank ditches and fortified positions converted the Kursk salient into a defensive killing ground of unprecedented depth and sophistication. The German armoured assault at Kursk, involving over 2,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, drove into this prepared position and was ground down in 8 days of brutal attritional fighting that was the antithesis of everything German armoured doctrine had been designed to achieve. The new Tiger and Panther tanks, on which Germany had placed great hopes, proved mechanically unreliable in their first major operational test, breaking down in large numbers. The Soviets had organized their anti-tank defense with a skill and thoroughness that the German assault could not penetrate, and the losses suffered by the attacking German formations, while severe, were less devastating than the strategic consequences of the operation's failure. With Citadel terminated after 8 days, partly because of Soviet counteroffensives on other parts of the front, and partly because of the Allied landings in Sicily, Germany had definitively lost the strategic initiative in the East. From Kursk onward, Germany was on the defensive everywhere, fighting a losing battle against an opponent that was growing stronger with every passing month while Germany grew steadily weaker. How did the German army respond to this inexorable strategic deterioration? The answer, in many ways, reveals something important about where its true effectiveness lay. Even in strategic defeat, even fighting on the defensive against overwhelming odds, the German army continued to demonstrate a level of tactical and operational skill that forced the Allies to pay an enormous price for every kilometre of ground they recovered. German defensive operations in the East from 1943 onward were characterized by the same qualities that had made German offensive operations so formidable: flexible, decentralized command, aggressive use of local counterattacks to disrupt attacking formations, skillful use of terrain, and a willingness to accept tactical risk in pursuit of operational advantage. The ratio of casualties inflicted to casualties suffered remained heavily in Germany's favour throughout the war. German soldiers consistently killed, wounded, or captured more of their opponents than they lost themselves, a reflection of the genuine tactical superiority that persisted even as the strategic situation grew hopeless. The story of German military effectiveness in the Second World War cannot be told without examining the specific commanders who embodied and drove that effectiveness most completely. We have already touched on Guderian and Manstein, but there were others whose contributions were equally significant and whose careers illuminate different dimensions of what made the German army so formidable. Erwin Rommel is perhaps the most widely known German commander of the Second World War outside of Germany itself, and with good reason. His campaigns in North Africa from 1941 to 1943 elevated him to a legendary status that transcended national boundaries. Even his British opponents, who had every reason to hate him, admired him. Winston Churchill famously said of Rommel in the House of Commons, referring to him as a remarkable general even while at war with him, and the British soldiers who fought against the Afrika Korps named their opponent the Desert Fox, a sobriquet that carried genuine respect alongside its tactical connotations. What made Rommel so remarkable, and what made him so representative of German military excellence at the individual command level? Rommel's genius lay primarily in the tactical and operational sphere, rather than in the grand strategic realm. He was not a deep strategic thinker like Manstein. He did not possess the broad institutional knowledge and system-building capacity of Guderian. What he had was an almost supernatural instinct for the dynamics of mobile battle, an ability to read a tactical situation at a glance and immediately identify the critical action required, and a personal magnetism and physical courage that inspired the soldiers under his command to extraordinary efforts. Rommel led from the front in a manner that was extreme even by the standards of German command culture. He was frequently to be found at the very tip of the advance, in a command vehicle or on foot, personally directing operations in the midst of the action, under fire. This was not merely personal bravado, it had a direct tactical function. By being present where the fighting was happening, Rommel could make immediate decisions based on first-hand observation rather than filtered reports, and he could respond to changes in the tactical situation far more rapidly than a commander who remained at a rear headquarters and waited for information to reach him. Rommel arrived in North Africa in February 1941 with a small German force sent to bolster the collapsing Italian position in Libya. The British had just completed a devastating offensive against the Italians that had destroyed several divisions and driven the Italian front in Libya to the edge of collapse. The British High Command believed that no significant German offensive could be mounted until the summer of 1941, when Rommel would have had time to properly organise and supply his forces. Rommel ignored this assessment entirely. Within days of his arrival, he was organising offensive operations, and within weeks he had launched an attack that drove the British back across Libya with a speed and violence that completely disoriented the British command. By April 1941, Rommel had reconquered almost all the territory the British had captured from the Italians in their recent offensive, had captured or killed several senior British generals, and had laid siege to the port of Tobruk, which the Australians and British garrisoning it refused to surrender. The subsequent back-and-forth campaigns in North Africa demonstrated both the heights and the limits of Rommel's particular brand of genius. At his best, Rommel was simply without equal as a practitioner of mobile armoured warfare in conditions that suited his style. His use of combined arms, integrating tanks, motorised infantry, anti-tank guns, artillery and air support into a fluid tactical system was masterful. He had a particular skill in the use of the German 88mm anti-aircraft gun in an anti-tank role, deploying it in carefully concealed positions that would lure British tank formations into attacks that were then devastated by the 88mm ability to destroy any Allied tank at long range. British commanders repeatedly fell into this trap, driving their armour forward in attacks that seemed to be succeeding only to find themselves suddenly under fire from anti-tank guns they had not seen and could not destroy without exposing their tanks to further losses. But Rommel also had significant weaknesses that ultimately contributed to his defeat. He was an improviser rather than a planner, a man who thrived in the fluid, chaotic dynamics of fast-moving battle, but who paid insufficient attention to the mundane but vital matters of supply and logistics. His insistence on continuing offensive operations beyond the point where his supply lines could sustain them created repeated crises that undid strategic gains his tactical brilliance had achieved. The capture of Tobruk in June 1942, one of the most impressive individual tactical achievements of the entire war, was followed immediately by an impulsive decision to continue the offensive into Egypt against the advice of his superiors when his forces were exhausted and his supply lines were at breaking point. This decision led ultimately to the defeat at El Alamein, where Rommel's army, facing General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army with adequate supplies and overwhelming material superiority, was fought to a standstill and then broken in the Second Battle of El Alamein in October and November 1942. The contrast between Rommel and his British opponent Montgomery is instructive. Montgomery was in many respects the antithesis of Rommel in command style. Where Rommel was instinctive, impulsive, and led from the front in the midst of battle, Montgomery was methodical, careful, and preferred to plan his battles with meticulous care before launching them, then execute them in a controlled, set-piece manner. Montgomery has often been criticized by admirers of Rommel for being unimaginative and overly cautious, but it is worth noting that Montgomery never lost a battle he had properly prepared, which is more than can be said for Rommel. The different command styles reflected different strengths and different contexts, and there is an argument to be made that Rommel's style was well suited to the situations of 1941 and early 1942, when Germany had operational initiative and was fighting an opponent who was consistently surprised and disoriented, but became a liability when the strategic situation had reversed, and what was required was not brilliant improvisation, but careful, methodical attrition of a stronger opponent. The North African campaign also illustrated a dimension of German military effectiveness that is sometimes overlooked: the extraordinary tactical competence of the ordinary German soldier in a wide variety of combat environments. The men of the Afrika Korps fought in conditions of extreme heat, water scarcity, and logistical difficulty that would have broken less tough and less well-trained formations. They maintained their fighting effectiveness through months of grueling desert warfare, adapted their tactics and equipment to the peculiar demands of desert combat, and fought with a consistency and professionalism that earned the genuine respect of their opponents. The desert was as alien an environment to the German soldier as the Russian winter, yet the Afrika Korps performed almost as effectively in the scorching heat of the Libyan and Egyptian desert as the Eastern Front panzer forces performed in the bitter cold of Russia. This adaptability was itself a product of the deep training and institutional culture that had produced such effective soldiers in the first place. The theatre that saw some of the most grinding and costly German defensive fighting was Italy, following the Allied invasions of Sicily in July 1943 and the Italian mainland in September 1943. Italy was, from the German perspective, a defensive theatre par excellence, a narrow peninsula with a spine of mountains and numerous rivers providing successive defensive lines that could be held by small forces against attacking armies of much greater strength. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, proved himself one of the war's outstanding defensive commanders, conducting a brilliant and protracted fighting retreat from Sicily all the way up the Italian peninsula that cost the Allies enormous casualties and prolonged the campaign by months or years beyond what the Allied planners had anticipated. Kesselring's conduct of the Italian campaign demonstrated all the qualities that made German defensive operations so costly for their opponents. He made maximum use of the terrain, positioning his forces on the forward slopes of mountains and ridges where they could bring fire to bear on attacking formations while remaining largely protected from counter-battery fire. He organised his defensive positions in depth so that even when the Allies broke through the first defensive line, they immediately encountered a second and then a third, with the German forces using the delay provided by each successive defence to prepare the next. He used his limited armour aggressively, concentrating it for local counterattacks against Allied penetrations, rather than dispersing it along the defensive line where it would be vulnerable to Allied firepower. And he maintained a constant pressure on Allied formations, even when on the defensive, raiding, counterattacking, and probing to deny the Allies the ability to rest and reorganise. The battles at Monte Cassino, fought between January and May 1944, became the iconic image of the Italian campaign's grinding attritional character. The Germans had fortified the historic monastery on a hill overlooking the entrance to the Liri Valley, and successive Allied attempts to break through this position were repulsed with enormous losses. The monastery itself was controversially destroyed by Allied bombing in February 1944, the Allies believing incorrectly that it was being used as a German observation post. But this made the position easier to defend rather than harder, as the rubble provided excellent cover for the German paratroopers defending it. It took 4 separate major assaults involving American, British, New Zealand, Indian, Free French and Polish troops before Monte Cassino was finally captured in May 1944. The tenacity of the German defenders, primarily Fallschirmjäger, parachute troops who had fought their way from Sicily and who maintained their extraordinary combat effectiveness throughout months of defensive fighting, was representative of the German military's ability to exact an enormous price even in strategic defeat. The German Fallschirmjäger, or paratroopers, deserve special mention in any discussion of German military effectiveness. Originally conceived as an elite shock force for offensive airborne operations, the Fallschirmjäger had delivered their most spectacular early result at the capture of the Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael in May 1940, when a tiny force of glider-borne troops landed on the roof of the world's largest and most modern fortress and neutralized it within hours, opening the way for the German advance into Belgium. By 1943 and 1944, strategic circumstances meant that the Fallschirmjäger were no longer being used in their intended role of airborne assault, but were fighting as elite infantry on every front where Germany was pressed hardest. Their performance in this role was consistently outstanding. Whether at Cassino, at Anzio, in Normandy, or on the Eastern Front, the Fallschirmjäger fought with a ferocity and tactical skill that made them the most feared opponents on the Allied and Soviet sides alike. The Normandy campaign of June to August 1944, following the Allied landings on June 6, 1944, provides another revealing case study in the character of German military effectiveness at a late stage of the war. The D-Day landings themselves, mounted by Allied forces of enormous strength and sustained by a logistical effort that dwarfed anything Germany could put in the field, succeeded in establishing a bridgehead on the Normandy coast despite fierce German opposition. The German defense of the beaches, conducted with limited forces and under severe constraints imposed by Hitler's insistence on retaining control of the panzer reserves rather than committing them immediately to drive the invaders back into the sea, was ultimately unsuccessful. But once the bridgehead had been established, the subsequent fighting in the Norman bocage demonstrated again the remarkable defensive effectiveness of the German army fighting in terrain that suited it. The bocage country of Normandy, with its dense hedgerows dividing the landscape into tiny fields separated by thick earthen banks topped with vegetation, was ideal defensive country. German defenders could conceal themselves and their weapons in the hedgerows, cover every lane and gap with interlocking fields of fire, and force attacking Allied troops to fight their way through each individual field at enormous cost. Allied soldiers, many of them fighting their first serious combat, found the bocage a brutal teacher. German defenders, who might have been outnumbered 5 or 10 to 1, were able to inflict severe casualties on attacking formations because the terrain negated Allied numerical and material superiority. American units fighting through the bocage in June and July 1944 suffered casualty rates that alarmed their commanders and threatened to exhaust their fighting strength before the breakout that strategic logic required. The German 352nd Infantry Division, which had been positioned by chance directly behind Omaha Beach on D-Day, and whose presence had not been detected by Allied intelligence, nearly drove the American landings back into the sea through sheer fighting effectiveness. Its defenders, positioned in well-prepared emplacements on the bluffs above the beach, inflicted catastrophic casualties on the American forces coming ashore, and for several hours the outcome at Omaha hung genuinely in the balance. The eventually successful American advance off Omaha Beach was achieved not through tactical finesse, but through individual acts of extraordinary courage by small groups of soldiers who kept moving forward, despite losses that would have stopped a less determined force. The German defense at Omaha demonstrated that even against an Allied force of enormous capability, the German soldier fighting in prepared positions with proper equipment and leadership could exact a terrible price. As the Allied breakout from Normandy gathered pace in late July and August 1944, and as American armoured forces under General George Patton's Third Army swept across France at a pace that recalled the German blitzkriegs of 1940, the German army faced the prospect of complete defeat in the West. Hitler's insistence on launching counterattacks rather than conducting strategic withdrawals led to the near encirclement of an entire German army group in the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, a catastrophe that destroyed the German ability to form a coherent defensive line in France. Yet even from this disaster, a significant portion of the encircled forces managed to escape, precisely because German small unit commanders used their initiative to find gaps in the closing Allied encirclement and drive through them with whatever forces they could assemble, acting in the tradition of Auftragstaktik, rather than waiting for orders from a high command that had long since lost meaningful control of the situation. The German army's capacity for self-renewal and continued resistance, even in the most desperate circumstances, was remarkable. After the Falaise disaster, Allied commanders fully expected the German front in the West to collapse entirely, as French resistance had collapsed in 1940. Instead, retreating German forces managed to form a new defensive line on the German border, incorporating the fortifications of the Siegfried Line, the West Wall, and there they held. The Allied advance that had seemed unstoppable in August slowed to a halt in September and October 1944, in part because Allied supply lines had outrun their logistics, but also because the German army, as battered and depleted as it was, retained enough fighting effectiveness to hold a prepared defensive position against opponents whose own supply problems prevented them from bringing their full strength to bear. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Operation Watch on the Rhine, was Germany's last great offensive gamble in the West. Hitler had assembled a force of 28 divisions, including several reconstituted panzer divisions, for an attack through the Ardennes designed to reach the port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. The plan was operationally audacious, again through the Ardennes as in 1940. And the opening days of the offensive achieved genuine tactical surprise, overrunning several American divisions before they could react and driving a 60-kilometer deep salient into the Allied line. The 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich and the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel made initial progress that alarmed Allied commanders and prompted General Eisenhower to deploy his strategic reserves, including the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, in a desperate effort to hold crucial road junctions. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated one final time both the residual fighting power of the German army and the fundamental impossibility of Germany's strategic situation. German armoured units showed flashes of the operational brilliance that had characterised the Wehrmacht's best days, and the paratroopers and panzer grenadiers fighting in the freezing Ardennes forests showed the same tenacity and tactical skill that German soldiers had displayed throughout the war. But the offensive was launched without adequate fuel, ammunition, or air support, relying on captured Allied supplies that the advancing German forces never reached. And once the weather cleared and Allied air power could again operate freely, the German spearheads were isolated and destroyed. The failure of the Ardennes offensive consumed Germany's last strategic reserves in the West, leaving nothing to oppose the Allied crossing of the Rhine that followed in March 1945. One cannot understand why the German army was so effective without also grappling with the darker dimension of that effectiveness. The Wehrmacht's fighting power was inseparable from the ideological and institutional context in which it operated. The German soldier's willingness to fight to extraordinary lengths, his cohesion and morale even in the worst circumstances, was not produced by discipline and training alone. It was also produced in part by ideological commitment, by the Nazification of the German military that accelerated from 1943 onward, and by the terror that both the regime and the army itself applied to soldiers who showed insufficient commitment. By 1944, Wehrmacht soldiers faced execution by military courts for a range of offences that would have been handled by lesser punishment in most other armies, and the knowledge of this contributed to the determination with which men fought on in situations that seemed objectively hopeless. The Wehrmacht was also deeply complicit in the crimes of the Nazi regime, a fact that cannot be separated from any honest assessment of its effectiveness. The brutal anti-partisan warfare on the Eastern Front, conducted according to orders that treated the civilian populations of occupied territories as potential enemies to be suppressed by any means necessary, produced atrocities of terrible scale. The murder of millions of Soviet prisoners of war, many deliberately starved to death, was not the work of the SS alone. The Wehrmacht participated in and facilitated the Holocaust, providing logistical support for the Einsatzgruppen, killing squads, seizing Jewish property, and deporting Jewish populations to extermination camps. The Commissar order, issued before Barbarossa began, required the execution of captured Soviet political officers, a clear violation of the laws of war. These crimes do not reduce the Wehrmacht's tactical and operational effectiveness, but they are an inextricable part of the history of the German army in the Second World War, and any assessment of German military effectiveness that ignores them is incomplete. How should we weigh the moral dimension against the purely military one? It is a question that historians have wrestled with ever since the war ended. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea promoted by many German veterans after the war and accepted for decades in Western military circles, that the regular German army had been a professional, even honourable force, untainted by the crimes of the SS and the Nazi Party, has been thoroughly demolished by historical research since the 1990s. Studies by historians like Omer Bartov, Christopher Browning, and many others have demonstrated conclusively that the Wehrmacht participated in criminal activities across every theatre of operations. The army that was so tactically brilliant, that produced commanders of such extraordinary skill and soldiers of such remarkable fighting quality, was also an instrument of a murderous regime that killed tens of millions of people. This moral complexity doesn't change the military historical question of why the German army was so effective, but it does contextualize it in ways that matter. The German soldier fought so effectively in part because he had been raised in and shaped by a society that had been perverted by Nazism, that had taught him that struggle and violence were not just acceptable, but noble, that had dehumanized the very opponents he was fighting, particularly in the East. The fanaticism that made German defensive positions so costly to attack in 1944 and 1945 was not purely the product of professional pride and unit cohesion. It was also the product of ideological commitment and the knowledge, particularly among veterans of the Eastern Front, of what German soldiers had done to Soviet civilians and what the advancing Soviet armies might do in return. The story of German military effectiveness in the Second World War is also the story of the men who were tasked with countering it, and here the record of the Allied armies is more impressive than the myth of German invincibility sometimes suggests. The British army that was driven into the sea at Dunkirk in 1940 rebuilt itself over the next 4 years into a formidable fighting force. By 1944, the British and Commonwealth armies had developed a sophisticated combined arms doctrine, effective logistics, and an operational method that, while less flashy than the German approach, was highly effective. The Americans, entering the war with an army that was in many respects the most inexperienced of any major belligerent, learned their trade with remarkable speed. General Patton's Third Army in the summer of 1944 showed an operational audacity and a capacity for fast-moving exploitation that recalled the German panzer drives of 1940 and 1941. The Soviet army that had been shattered in 1941 had by 1944 developed into a machine of enormous power and increasing sophistication, capable of planning and executing operations of a scale and complexity that no army in history had previously attempted. The question of what role German technology played in German military effectiveness is one that generates considerable debate. The German army was not the most technologically advanced force in the war in all respects. German tanks in 1939 and 1940 were in many ways inferior to their French opponents. The Panzer I and Panzer II, which made up the bulk of German armoured strength at the start of the war, were lightly armoured reconnaissance vehicles rather than main battle tanks in the fullest sense. The Panzer III and Panzer IV were more capable but still inferior in armour protection and in some respects in firepower to the French Char B-1 Bis and the British Matilda II. Germany won the armoured campaigns of 1939 and 1940 not because of technological superiority, but because of superior doctrine, superior command, and superior integration of arms. As the war progressed, German technology did produce some genuinely outstanding weapons. The Tiger I tank, introduced in 1942, outclassed virtually every Allied tank it initially faced. Its 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges beyond which the opposing tank could return effective fire, and its heavy armour provided protection that made it formidably difficult to kill. The Panther tank, introduced in 1943, was arguably the finest medium tank of the Second World War, combining excellent firepower, good protection, and reasonable mobility in a package that rivaled or exceeded anything the Allies could put in the field. The King Tiger, or Tiger II, introduced in 1944, was essentially invulnerable to frontal fire from any Allied weapon of the period. These were impressive weapons by any standard, but they were weapons that could not be produced in sufficient numbers, could not be adequately maintained in the field, and had mechanical reliability problems that significantly reduced their operational availability. The Tiger I, for all its combat effectiveness, was notoriously unreliable mechanically, consuming enormous quantities of fuel and requiring more maintenance than the German army's overstretched repair facilities could readily provide. The Panther, though outstanding when it worked, was plagued by transmission problems in its early production versions that caused large numbers to break down before they even reached the front. These were the consequences of Germany's industrial limitations and of the tendency to over-engineer weapons in pursuit of technical perfection at the expense of simplicity and reliability. The Americans, by contrast, produced the M4 Sherman tank in vast numbers. The Sherman was individually inferior to both the Tiger and the Panther, a fact that caused enormous casualties among American tankers in the Normandy campaign. But American armoured forces could replace losses with a speed that the Germans could not match, and the numerical advantage this produced eventually proved more decisive than the qualitative edge the Germans held. The V weapons, the V1 flying bomb, and the V2 ballistic missile represented Germany's most technologically innovative contribution to the war, and in some respects the beginning of the era of modern strategic missile warfare. The V2 in particular was a genuinely revolutionary weapon, the world's first operational ballistic missile, capable of travelling at supersonic speeds along a trajectory that took it above the atmosphere, making it impossible to intercept with any contemporary technology. But as a weapon of war in the specific context of 1944 and 1945, the V weapons were strategically irrelevant. They killed civilians, caused terror and disruption, and consumed enormous resources of German industry and scientific talent. But they could not change the fundamental strategic situation. They were weapons that a desperate regime fired at the civilian populations of London and Antwerp because it had no other means of striking back at the forces closing in on Germany from every direction. The role of German scientific and industrial talent in the war effort is a fascinating dimension of German military effectiveness that extends beyond the weapons themselves. Germany's research establishment produced an extraordinary range of innovations during the war, from the world's first operational jet aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me 262, to early guided missiles, to sophisticated submarine technology, to advances in radar and communications. Many of these innovations came too late, were produced in too small numbers, or consumed too many resources for their actual military value to justify their development in the circumstances of 1944 and 1945. But they testify to a depth of scientific and engineering talent that, had it been channeled more effectively and earlier into the war effort, might have had a more significant impact on the conflict's outcome. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, is a particularly poignant example of German technical innovation that arrived too late to change the war's outcome. The Me 262 was a generation ahead of anything the Allies had in operational service when it began flying combat missions in 1944. Its speed, over 800 kilometers per hour, made it nearly impossible to catch in conventional combat, and its four 30mm cannons gave it devastating firepower against Allied bomber formations. Had the Me 262 been available in quantity in 1942 or 1943, before Allied bomber offensive had grown to the scale it eventually reached, it might have fundamentally altered the air war over Germany. But delays in development, Hitler's insistence at one point that it be used primarily as a bomber rather than as a fighter, and Allied bombing of the factories producing it and its engines meant that the Me 262 arrived in operational service too late and in too small numbers to change the fundamental equation of Allied air superiority. What does an examination of individual German commanders and their careers tell us about the sources of German military effectiveness? Let us look more closely at several figures whose stories illuminate different aspects of this effectiveness. Walter Model was perhaps the German army's most effective defensive commander, and his career in the final years of the war illustrates the remarkable ability of the German military system to produce officers capable of performing effectively under conditions that would have broken a lesser man. Born in 1891, Model was not, by the standards of the German officer corps, a man of distinguished social or military lineage. He was not a Prussian aristocrat or a scion of a military family. He rose through the ranks on the basis of competence, energy, and a quality that his superiors and subordinates both recognized, an almost ferocious determination that manifested itself equally in offensive operations and defensive ones. By the middle years of the war, Model had established a reputation as the man Hitler turned to when a front was collapsing. He was called to stabilize the Army Group Center front after the catastrophic Soviet Operation Bagration Offensive in the summer of 1944, when the largest single military operation in history had torn an enormous gap in the German front and threatened to completely collapse the German position in the east. That model managed to stabilize this situation at all. Assembling desperate scratch forces from every available source and throwing them into the gap was widely considered one of the remarkable performances of the war. Model's command style was characteristically German in its emphasis on leading from forward positions, maintaining close contact with the fighting, and demanding aggressive action even in desperate circumstances. But it was also distinctively his own. He was famously abrasive, confrontational, and impatient with subordinates who he felt were being insufficiently decisive. He challenged and overruled officers senior to him when he believed they were wrong, including on one occasion confronting Hitler directly about the strategic folly of an order. This directness was unusual even in the German army, where a degree of deference to higher authority remained the norm even as Auftragstaktik encouraged independent action in tactical and operational matters. Model understood that in the desperate circumstances of the later war, conventional deference was a luxury the Wehrmacht could not afford. He was transferred to the West in August 1944 to stabilize the collapsing front after Falaise, briefly holding the twin appointments of commander of both Army Group B and Commander-in-Chief West. When the Ardennes offensive collapsed and the Western Front became untenable, Model refused to surrender, maintaining resistance in the Ruhr pocket until no further organized resistance was possible. On April 21, 1945, with his forces destroyed and his army group dissolved, Walter Model walked into a forest near Duisburg and shot himself. He was 53 years old. Gotthard Heinrici provides another window into German defensive excellence in the war's final stages. Less famous than Manstein, Rommel, or Guderian, Heinrici was considered by many of his contemporaries and by subsequent military historians to be the finest defensive commander the German army produced. His special skill lay in what might be called the elastic defense, the technique of pulling his forward troops back just before an expected major enemy offensive, so that the enormous artillery bombardment that the Soviets typically launched to precede their attacks fell largely on empty positions, and then counterattacking the disorganized advancing Soviet troops with forces held in reserve. This technique, which required precise timing, detailed intelligence about enemy intentions, and the steady nerve to deliberately surrender ground in order to preserve the fighting strength of his troops, infuriated Hitler, who regarded any voluntary withdrawal as a moral failure. But it was devastatingly effective, and the casualty ratios that Heinrici's armies consistently achieved testified to its value. When Heinrici was appointed commander of Army Group Vistula in March 1945 for the defense of Berlin itself, he employed the same technique for the Seelow Heights battle in April 1945, withdrawing his troops before the massive Soviet artillery preparation that opened Operation Berlin. The delay this caused to the Soviet advance was limited by the scale of Soviet superiority, but it cost Zhukov days and enormous casualties that he could not have afforded in earlier stages of the war. Heinrici was relieved of command in the final days of the Berlin battle for refusing to commit troops to a counterattack that he considered suicidal and pointless, yet another example of a German commander placing professional judgment above compliance with orders that defied military logic. The story of German military effectiveness must also address the failures of strategy and leadership that ultimately brought Germany to defeat, because understanding those failures helps clarify what effectiveness at the operational and tactical level can and cannot achieve. Hitler's role as a military commander is one of the most extensively analysed questions in the history of the Second World War. His record is paradoxical. In the early years of the war, his willingness to back bold, unconventional plans, his instinctive understanding of the psychological dimensions of warfare, and his political genius in managing alliances and neutralizing potential opposition contributed significantly to German success. His support for Guderian's armoured doctrine, his endorsement of Manstein's Ardennes plan, his bold decision-making in the first years of the war all reflect genuine strategic intuition. But as the war progressed and Germany's position deteriorated, Hitler's interventions in military affairs became increasingly harmful. His insistence on holding every position to the last, his refusal to allow tactical withdrawals that would have preserved forces for future operations, his dismissal of commanders who disagreed with him, and his unwillingness to face the strategic reality that Germany could not win a prolonged war against the Allied coalition, collectively caused enormous unnecessary losses and foreclosed options that might have prolonged the war, if not changed its outcome. The stand-fast order at Moscow in 1941 may have prevented a rout. The The same instinct applied across every subsequent crisis did not. The failure to allow the Sixth Army to break out of Stalingrad, the insistence on holding Tunisia after North Africa, was strategically lost. The refusal to allow elastic defensive withdrawals in the east, the strategic dispersal of effort between objectives that should have been prioritized, all these decisions cost Germany blood and material it could not replace. Hitler's relationship with his senior commanders was a study in dysfunction that grew progressively worse as the war went on. The Führer's contempt for what he saw as the excessive caution of the professional military establishment led to a pattern of dismissing commanders whose advice contradicted his own convictions, surrounding himself with yes-men who told him what he wanted to hear, and increasingly making operational decisions himself at the level of detail that should have been left to corps and army commanders. By 1944, Hitler was personally directing the movements of individual divisions, ordering units held in specific positions regardless of the tactical situation, and overruling his commanders on questions that were well beyond his competence. This micromanagement, combined with the yes-man culture that his intolerance of disagreement had created around him, progressively stripped the German military of the flexibility and decentralized initiative that had been its greatest strength. The contrast between the German High Command's performance and that of the Allied Supreme Command, particularly after Eisenhower took over, is illuminating. Eisenhower was not, in the narrow military sense, as brilliant a battlefield commander as many of his subordinates, but he possessed qualities of coordination, coalition management, and strategic judgment that proved indispensable for an alliance war. He managed the competing egos and national interests of American, British, French, and other Allied commanders with a skill that Hitler, who dealt with his own allies and subordinates largely through intimidation and authority, was wholly incapable of matching. And Eisenhower, unlike Hitler, was willing to delegate operational authority to commanders who had demonstrated competence and to accept their assessments of tactical situations without overriding them for political or ego-driven reasons. One of the most revealing measures of German military effectiveness is the statistical record of combat performance. Historians and military analysts, particularly the German-American military historian Trevor Dupuy, conducted extensive analyses of casualty exchange ratios in various engagements throughout the war and consistently found that German forces inflicted significantly higher casualties than they suffered, often by a margin of 1.5 to 1 or even higher across a wide range of tactical situations, theatres of operations, and stages of the war. German forces on the defensive typically performed even better than German forces on the offensive, and German forces fighting in favourable terrain like Italy or the Bocage better still. These statistical findings, which have been confirmed and refined by subsequent researchers, suggest that the German tactical advantage was real, consistent, and not reducible to any single factor. What produced this statistical advantage? Dupuy and others attributed it to a combination of factors they termed combat effectiveness or fighting power, including the quality of training, the doctrine and command system, the integration of combined arms, and what they called the organizational coherence or ethos of the force, a quality that encompasses unit cohesion, morale, and the institutional culture that sustained effective action under the most adverse conditions. This analysis broadly aligns with what we have been examining throughout this video. The German advantage was systemic rather than attributable to any single element, and it proved remarkably persistent across changing circumstances because it was rooted in deep institutional traditions rather than in temporary or material advantages that could be eroded or overcome. The role of unit cohesion and small group dynamics in German military effectiveness deserves particular emphasis. The sociologists Edward Schills and Morris Janowitz published a landmark study after the war of the German army's cohesion and morale, analysing why German soldiers continued to fight so effectively for so long in conditions of obvious strategic hopelessness. Their finding, which has been confirmed and elaborated by subsequent scholarship, was that the primary motivation was not ideological commitment to Nazism, as Allied wartime propaganda had assumed, but rather loyalty to the primary group, the immediate squad, section or platoon, of men with whom the soldier lived, ate, slept, and fought. German soldiers fought and died for their comrades, for the men immediately around them, because unit cohesion had been cultivated with such deliberate care by the German military system that it became the dominant emotional reality of the soldiers' existence. This small group cohesion was remarkably resistant to the kind of ideological questioning that might have undermined an army fighting on behalf of an obviously criminal regime. Men did not ask themselves whether the war was just or the cause was right in the middle of a firefight. They fought for the man next to them. The Wehrmacht's success in maintaining this small group cohesion under conditions of catastrophic attrition and replacement was partly a product of its policy of keeping units together rather than using individual replacement systems. When a German division suffered heavy casualties, it was typically pulled from the line to rebuild as a unit, maintaining its command structure and whatever experienced veterans remained while incorporating replacements as a group. This stood in contrast to the American replacement system, which fed individual replacements into units to maintain their strength, a practice that military psychologists and veterans both identified as damaging to cohesion, because it meant that new men were perpetually joining a group without the bonds of shared experience. The German practice was not without its own problems, particularly when the scale of losses made unit reconstitution difficult, but as a general principle it contributed significantly to the cohesion and effectiveness that the German army maintained throughout the war. Another dimension of German military effectiveness that merits examination is the role of the German military tradition in creating what might be called a learning organization. The Wehrmacht at its best was not merely an organization that trained its soldiers in established methods and sent them to fight. It was an organization that continuously learned from its experience, incorporated lessons from combat into doctrine and training, and adapted its methods to changing circumstances. The after-action review, the systematic examination of what had worked and what had not in recent operations, was a standard feature of German military practice at every level. Lessons identified in Poland were incorporated into preparations for France. Lessons from France were applied to the planning for Barbarossa. When the Eastern Front produced new challenges for which existing doctrine was inadequate, the Wehrmacht adapted, developing new techniques for winter warfare, anti-partisan operations, and defensive battle that reflected genuine organizational learning. This learning capacity was not unlimited, and it was compromised in the later years of the war by the increasing rigidity that Hitler's interference in military affairs imposed on the command system. But at its best, the German army's ability to learn and adapt faster than its opponents was a genuine competitive advantage. It meant that a technique that worked against German forces once might not work again, because the Germans would have identified the vulnerability and developed countermeasures. It meant that tactical innovations developed by junior officers in response to specific combat problems were identified, disseminated, and incorporated into broader practice in a way that multiplied their effect. And it meant that the German army, far more than most of its opponents, was genuinely grappling with the problem of how to fight most effectively, rather than simply repeating established methods. The experience of German soldiers in the final months of the war, fighting in the ruins of their own country against an enemy that was literally crossing Germany's borders from east, west, and south simultaneously, reveals something important about the limits of military effectiveness divorced from strategic coherence. By early 1945, the German military situation was objectively hopeless. The Red Army was already on the Oder River, barely 60 kilometers from Berlin. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. Germany's cities were being reduced to rubble by Allied strategic bombing. The industrial base that sustained military operations was collapsing. Food and fuel were desperately scarce. Yet German soldiers continued to fight, continued to resist, continued to inflict casualties on their opponents at a rate that astonished Allied commanders who expected imminent German collapse, continuing literally until the final hours of the war in some cases. Why did German soldiers continue to fight in these impossible circumstances? The answer involves several factors operating simultaneously. Small group cohesion, as Schills and Janowitz had identified, remained a powerful motivator even as the strategic situation became indefensible. The German military justice system, which had executed over 20,000 German soldiers for desertion, cowardice, or other military offences during the war, a number vastly exceeding comparable figures for any other major belligerent, provided a brutal incentive for continued resistance. The collapse of civil society in Germany and the presence of roving SS and military police courts that hanged deserters from lampposts and balconies with signs around their necks reading "coward" and "traitor" meant that for many German soldiers, the calculation was simply that continued resistance offered a better chance of survival than the alternatives. And for soldiers on the Eastern Front, the knowledge of what German forces had done to the Soviet Union and the fear of Soviet reprisals provided a particularly powerful incentive to keep fighting, or at least to continue moving westward and surrender to the Americans or British rather than the Soviets. The German Volkssturm, the national militia established in September 1944 and composed largely of men too old, too young, or too physically unfit for regular military service, provides a contrast that illuminates the difference between trained professional soldiers and improvised forces. Armed often with inadequate weapons, given minimal training, and thrown into combat situations that would have taxed experienced frontline troops, the Volkssturm was largely ineffective militarily. Its members, ordinary German civilians suddenly thrust into the role of soldiers, typically lacked the deep training, unit cohesion, and institutional culture that had made the regular Wehrmacht so formidable. They fought, in some cases with genuine courage, but they could not compensate for the absence of the qualities that years of professional military development had instilled in the Wehrmacht. The contrast between the continued fighting effectiveness of experienced German Army, SS, and Fallschirmjäger units, and the general ineffectiveness of the Volkssturm is perhaps the clearest possible illustration of how deeply rooted in institutional quality, rather than in any specific material or situational advantage, German military effectiveness truly was. The Waffen-SS deserves mention in any discussion of German military effectiveness because by the middle years of the war, the better Waffen-SS divisions had become among the most formidable fighting formations in any army. Originally established as a political armed force separate from the Wehrmacht, the Waffen-SS benefited from priority access to the best equipment, including the first Tigers and Panthers, and from a process of selection and training that, at least in its elite divisions, was arguably even more rigorous than the Wehrmacht's already demanding standards. Waffen-SS divisions like the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, Totenkopf, and Hitlerjugend consistently performed at the highest tactical and operational level, and they were frequently deployed to crisis points where their fighting quality could be used to greatest effect. The battle records of these divisions in the later war years, often fighting against overwhelming odds, were extraordinary even by the high standards of the German army as a whole. But the Waffen-SS also represents the most concentrated expression of the connection between German military effectiveness and the criminal ideology it served. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler and other Waffen SS formations committed documented atrocities across every theatre in which they fought, from the murder of British prisoners at Wehrmacht in 1940 to the Malmedy massacre of American prisoners during the Battle of the Bulge to the systematic brutality with which SS formations conducted anti-partisan operations in the East and the Balkans. The fighting effectiveness of Waffen-SS formations cannot be understood in isolation from their participation in the crimes of the regime they represented. They were elite soldiers in the service of a genocidal state, and their effectiveness as soldiers cannot be separated from that context. What ultimately ended German military effectiveness in the Second World War was not any single defeat, not even Stalingrad, and not any technological breakthrough or tactical innovation by the Allies, though Allied methods certainly improved dramatically as the war progressed. It was the fundamental mismatch between Germany's strategic ambitions and its resource base, compounded by a political system that made rational strategic planning impossible and by the decisions of a military political dictator who was incapable of acknowledging failure and adjusting strategy accordingly. Germany in 1939 had a population of approximately 80 million people and an industrial economy that, while significant, was substantially smaller than those of its eventual opponents taken together. When Germany fought Poland alone, France alone, or the Soviet Union before the Western Allies had fully mobilized their strength, German tactical and operational excellence could compensate for material inferiority. When Germany was fighting the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire simultaneously, no degree of tactical excellence could overcome the arithmetic of industrial production and manpower. The American war economy, which had been fully mobilized by 1943 and 1944, produced in each of those years more aircraft, tanks, ships, and military equipment than Germany and all its allies combined. Soviet industry, rebuilt beyond the Urals after the catastrophic losses of 1941 and 1942, was producing enormous quantities of T-34 tanks, artillery pieces, and ammunition by 1943. British production, supplemented by American Lend-Lease, was maintaining the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force at levels that Germany could not challenge. Against this ocean of material, Germany's tactical excellence was like a rock, admirable in its hardness but unable to stop the tide. The rock was worn down, gradually and at enormous cost to those doing the wearing, but worn down nonetheless. What lessons has the world drawn from the German army's effectiveness in the Second World War? The influence on subsequent military thinking has been profound and lasting. The concept of Auftragstaktik, mission command, is today a foundational principle of military doctrine in NATO and most Western armies. The American Army, which had traditionally favoured a more top-down directive command approach, explicitly adopted mission command as a doctrinal principle in the reforms that followed the Vietnam War and the creation of the air-land battle doctrine in the 1980s. The German approach to combined arms integration, with its emphasis on tanks, infantry, artillery, engineers and air support working together as a coordinated team, rather than as separate arms providing mutual support, is today considered standard military practice in every modern army. The emphasis on decentralized initiative, on cultivating leaders at every level who can act effectively without waiting for orders, has shaped officer education programs from West Point to Sandhurst to military academies around the world. The study of German operational art, the level of war between strategy and tactics concerned with planning and executing campaigns, became a major academic and professional military subject from the 1970s onward. American military analysts and theorists studying the German army's performance in the Second World War found in it a model of operational excellence that they believed American forces needed to emulate if they were to deal effectively with the Soviet army, which had itself learned much from fighting the Germans. The German concept of Schwerpunkt, the concentration of effort at the decisive point, and the operational techniques of encirclement, the Kesselschlacht or cauldron battle, became subjects of intense study in American military colleges and planning staffs. There is, however, a danger in drawing too uncritical lessons from German military effectiveness. The armies that study and admire the Wehrmacht's operational excellence need to be careful about what exactly they are admiring and what they are proposing to emulate. The Wehrmacht's effectiveness was not separable from the regime it served, the society that produced it, or the particular historical circumstances that shaped both. An army that cultivates Auftragstaktik and mission command in the service of democratic values and the laws of war is a different thing from an army that used the same principles in the service of a genocidal dictatorship. The technical military lessons of the German army's effectiveness can be studied and applied. The moral context in which they were applied must never be forgotten. What can we say then, by way of summary, about why the German army was so effective in the Second World War? The answer, as this examination has shown, is multifaceted and deeply rooted. It begins with the long tradition of Prussian and German military culture, particularly the doctrine of Auftragstaktik, that empowered and expected independent judgment from commanders at every level. It continues with the deliberate institutional cultivation of quality over quantity in the Reichswehr period, when the constraints of Versailles forced Germany to build a small but exceptionally well-trained and well-led professional force. It extends to the doctrinal revolution of mechanized warfare, synthesized and championed by Guderian, Manstein, and their colleagues, which created a genuinely new way of waging war that Germany's opponents were not prepared to counter. It encompasses the quality of the German officer, an NCO corps, trained to a standard of professional competence and initiative that few other armies matched. It includes the rigorous and realistic training that produced soldiers capable of operating effectively under the extreme stress and chaos of modern battle. And it is sustained by the remarkable tactical and operational performance that German forces maintained across 6 years of the most destructive war in human history, even as strategic circumstances increasingly demanded the impossible. The German army was effective because of what it had trained itself to be over decades of institutional development. It was effective because its doctrine, command philosophy, and organizational culture were well suited to the kind of mobile, fast-paced warfare that the mid-20th century's military technology made possible, and that Guderian and his colleagues had the insight and institutional influence to develop and champion. It was effective because it produced commanders of genuine genius: Manstein, Guderian, Rommel, Kesselring, Model, and dozens of others at every level of command, whose operational and tactical brilliance multiplied the effect of every soldier and weapon under their command. And it was effective, with a persistence and consistency that still astonishes those who study it, because of the qualities of the ordinary German soldier: trained, cohesive, adaptive, and deeply committed to the men beside him, if not always to the cause above him. But the German army was also, ultimately, not effective enough, not in the sense that matters most, the sense of achieving its political objectives. Whatever the tactical and operational excellence of the Wehrmacht, it failed in its fundamental strategic mission of winning the war for Nazi Germany. That failure was inevitable, given the nature of the regime it served, the enemies it made, and the material realities it could not overcome. The military lessons of German effectiveness are real and have been productively incorporated into the practice of armies that fight in the service of very different values. The strategic and moral lessons of German failure are equally real, and they speak to the relationship between military power and political wisdom, between tactical brilliance and strategic coherence, and between the effectiveness of an army and the justice of the cause for which it fights. Well, that is it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed learning about the German military machine and what made it such a formidable force in the Second World War, make sure to check out our video about what happened to Germany's top field marshals after World War II, and our video about what happened to German generals after World War II. There is much more to explore about the fascinating and complex history of the Second World War, and we will keep bringing you the stories that deserve to be told. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one. One final thread worth pulling in our examination of German military effectiveness is the role that Germany's enemies played in ultimately forging their own effectiveness in response to German methods. The British army that had been driven from France in 1940 spent the subsequent years in a systematic effort to understand what had gone wrong and to build a force capable of beating the Germans at their own game. Officers like Major General Percy Hobart, who was actually dismissed from command before the war for advocating armoured warfare ideas too radical for the conservative British military establishment to accept, were eventually recalled and given the opportunity to apply their ideas in the creation of specialised armoured formations. The Funnies, as Hobart's specialised armoured vehicles were nicknamed, the tanks fitted with flails to clear minefields, the amphibious DD tanks, the bridge-laying tanks and flame-throwing tanks that were deployed on D-Day, represent a British solution to the problem of breaching fortified beach defences that was every bit as creative and technically innovative as anything the Germans had produced. The fact that the Americans largely declined to use Hobart's Funnies on their sectors of the Normandy beaches, to the significant additional cost in casualties at Omaha, is itself an instructive lesson in the dangers of institutional conservatism. The Soviet Army's transformation between 1941 and 1944 is one of the most remarkable stories of organizational learning in military history. The force that had been shattered repeatedly in the opening months of Barbarossa, that had lost millions of men and thousands of tanks in the great encirclement battles of 1941, rebuilt itself into a machine capable of planning and executing operations of a scale and sophistication that surpassed anything Germany could mount by the war's final years. Soviet operations like Bagration in June and July 1944, which destroyed Army Group Center in a matter of weeks in the largest operation on the Eastern Front since Barbarossa itself, displayed a mastery of the operational art, of deception, of coordination between multiple army groups, and of logistics that showed how thoroughly the Red Army had learned the lessons Germany had taught it in the school of catastrophic defeat.